Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the machine quilting party. Today we're quilting concentric squares, one of my favorite walking foot style quilting designs. It's super simple to stitch and I want to try knocking it out with minimal quilt marking. So let's jump on the machine and see how this works with walking foot style quilting. So I'm getting started with concentric squares and I have drawn a very small square shape and then diagonal lines coming out from the corners. So basically I can stitch this starting square, then use the edge of my walking foot as a guide to stitch more squares around it. Now concentric squares can be a little slow and a little tricky because we're going to break thread between each one. So I'm going to pull up thread here and we're going to get started. The smallest square is always the most tedious because of course it's the smallest, and nice tiny little lines here, a lot of direction changes. So I'm going to just stitch carefully over and keep these thread tails out of my way as I stitch right on that line. So it's going to be really short little lines here. I decided to start with a 1/2 inch square right at the beginning, but you know, you could start with a bigger square if you wanted to. You can also space your lines, you know, as far apart as your batting allows. And this is a big thing that I talked about in the book, and that is the scale, how much quilting your quilt actually needs in order to be filled. And whenever I quilt more densely, like on a 1/2 inch scale, like I'm going to be doing today, it's mostly for the design. It's mostly for making the quilt look good and having lots of texture over the surface. So I've broken those thread tails and now I'm going to pick out, what I'm doing is just tugging on that top thread I just broke, and that brings up a bobbin thread. That is the bobbin thread that I just broke from the end. So I have 2 sets of thread tails. I want to tie these into 2 separate knots, not keep them all in one big globby knot, because that will not only be challenging to bury in the middle layer of the quilt, it'll also possibly get unpicked because 4 threads together in a knot makes a really big kind of loose knot, and most likely they're going to come apart. So I'm going to do 2 threads in one, send it through the quilt, and I'm just using a cheater needle here. You can find another video on hiding your thread tails where I go into a lot more detail and I'm a lot more slow and careful about teaching you how to do that. I'm just going to quickly bury this so that way I can continue moving on with the design. So if you've never seen me do this, please check out the other video. And as you can see, I'm very speedy at it and it only takes a couple seconds. And I keep that cheater needle right next to my machine so that way I can grab it and quickly do that. And that way I always have those thread tails nicely buried and I don't have a noticeable start and stop. I mean, looking at that square, you would not know which corner I started on. So I'm going to grab my ruler again because my lines have gone just a little faint, and I'm just lining that up and just marking a diagonal line from corner to corner. And this is the thing about squares. I could mark every single square on the quilt, of course. It'd be pretty time consuming and a little slow. Or I can just simply mark the points that we're going to change direction. And that's helpful because I can sit here and I can line up 2 things. I can line up the edge of my walking foot with the edge of this square, and then I can sink my needle down right on that diagonal marked line. And if I do both of those things, then I know I'm going to end up with a nice evenly spaced square around it. So here we go. Now I'm going to stitch straight line down, and when I get to that marked diagonal line, I'm going to stop and pivot. And then now again, I want to make sure to line up edge of my walking foot on the edge of the square and my needles right in that diagonal line. Stitch the next line. Again, stop, pivot, turn it around. Watch out for needles, your pens and pin mores. If you've used that to baste your block, make sure that they're not going to hang up on the foot and cause some problems. Of course, I've also got minky fabric here on the back, and that's a little fluffy, so if you see it kind of get a little bit messy, that's what that is. All right, so again, making sure that edge of the foot is lined up, making sure that I'm going to stitch a nice straight line going down. Now, if you wanted to stitch this on a bigger scale, of course, all you have to do is use a quilting guide. That's a guide bar that you can attach to your walking foot. Most walking feet have them, where you can just pop in at a little bar, and that is going to help you space wider apart lines. And I measured my guide bar, and I could possibly do lines up to 3 inches apart. So that would really increase the scale and, of course, the speed of stitching this design. I'm quilting this on a 1/2 inch scale, so it's going to be pretty dense and it's going to take a little while, especially with all of these thread breaks. So because of that reason, this is not a design that I would pick if I was in a hurry. It's just not a good choice. You know, this is a design where, you know, I'm content to spend a little bit of time and energy tying off thread tails and quilting squares within squares within squares. If I was also stitching this into a pieced quilt, there is a possibility that you could escape from one square to the next using the piecing lines to escape through. So let's say I was putting this, let's talk about the log cabin quilt we're making and how I escape from one area to another. I could just simply stitch in the ditch from one area to another, and that would allow me to stitch the next square without having to break thread. Now on this quilt, because it was so big, I just went on ahead and broke thread with each one on the log cabin quilt, but that's a possibility. If you're stitching this and there's piecing lines, you can sometimes use them to your advantage. When I'm stitching something like this is essentially a whole cloth where you're gonna see it. If you try and do an escape hatch like that, I'm gonna break thread with every single square, and that's just how it's gonna have to go. You know, you could also play around with this. You could do different effects. You could bring some lines closer together. You could stitch some lines further apart. Of course, the bigger the square gets, the longer these lines will get, and it won't feel quite such a stop-start kind of situation. But you know, it's one of those things. I think it's important to have a variety of designs in your toolbox, where some designs you know are going to be a little slower and a little trickier, but they're also special. And when I see a quilt that's been quilted with something like this, I instantly know and acknowledge how much effort went into it, and that certainly makes me look at it in a different way. And you know, an alternative too, if you really like the square straight lines and you really like that effect, another option is square spiral, where you're stitching from the center with a spiral and working your way out, and you don't have to break thread at all. So that's another possibility as well. Notice how I'm breaking and going ahead and hiding this thread before I stitch down to it. I find that easier because sometimes when you hit that starting point, it can lock the two together in a funky way, and it can be hard to tie them off. So a lot of times when I'm stitching around, I will go on ahead and hide one thread, then as I stitch down with the next line, then breaking and tying off that second set of thread tails is just a little bit faster. So that's how I'm going to continue working this design. I'm just going to stitch one line at a time around this square shape. I might put a ruler on top of it every once in a while just to make sure I'm maintaining a nice square shape. I can see this angle is ever so slightly off, and I might correct for that in the next line. So it really depends on how picky you want to be. I'm going to stitch a few more lines, and then I'll turn the camera back on and show you what it's like whenever the square gets a little bit bigger. So I've continued quilting several squares, and here's kind of the benefit of starting asymmetrical. Once I reach the point where I hit the outlines of my quilting space, I no longer have to stop and break thread. So these last few lines around this side are going to be much, much faster because I can just stitch this side, then rotate the quilt around and stitch the opposite edge too. So there is a benefit definitely to quilting asymmetrical within a quilting square. It not only makes it more interesting, it might reduce the number of thread breaks, and you can always play off those edges in order to stitch your design. Now, if you were to quilt this asymmetrical in a quilt, and definitely on your home machine, I probably wouldn't shift it off the center more than 12 inches. Simply because you really do want to be working from the center of your quilting space to the outer edges. So if you go more than 12 inches, you could risk dealing with some pleats and puckers because you're not really in the center of the quilt. So just keep that in mind. Now here, I'd have to rotate all the way around, but I'm gonna just instead hit my back key, my reverse, so I can just stitch straight backwards, and that's going to set me up here. So now this edge of the walking foot is lined up with that previous line of stitching, and then now I'm going to quilt in this direction. Now with this angle, I've got all of the quilt here kind of rolled up into the arm of the machine. It's not a big deal, but it is a little bit more bulky than it would be otherwise when I'm stitching in the opposite direction. But hey, this minimizes the thread break, so I'm going to take it and stitch whatever direction I can in order to quilt this quickly. So it is really nice when you get to this, this area and you can just stitch faster and see that progress being made with fewer stops and starts. I talk about this a little bit. Just getting into a flow of quilting is really nice, and for me, lots of starts and stops makes it hard to find that flow, and really get in the groove. And I find when I can quilt continuously with fewer stops and starts, that's really when I knock out a large amount of the quilt very quickly and also really feel good about it to kind of get in the zone. I hope that makes sense. And here's what it looks like whenever I finished Concentric Squares. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about quilting concentric squares and you're ready to give it a try in a real quilt. We're not just quilting a square of concentric squares for the Marvelous Mosaic quilt, we're also quilting this in our Rainbow Log Cabin quilt too. So make sure to watch the videos for the Rainbow Log Cabin quilt as well so you can get lots of tips and tricks for not just stitching this on a smaller project, but also quilting it on something bigger. And yes, I really do believe that you can quilt big quilts on your home sewing machine. It really has a lot to do with your table setup. So make sure to watch our other video with tips on setting up your sewing machine, setting up your tables, so you're able to quilt bigger quilts pretty easily. It's never going to be super easy, but there's definitely some things that you can do to make it easier, to feel a lot lighter with less strain on your body. So I hope that you're looking forward to those other videos. You'll go and check them out. If you'd like to join in the fun and create the Marvelous Mosaic quilt or the Rainbow Log Cabin quilt with me, you can find the quilt patterns in the book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. This book comes with 30 cool quilting designs for walking foot style quilting, as well as 7 beautiful quilt projects for you to stitch out and give a try. So I hope that you'll come and check out the book at leahday.com/walkingfoot. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt.